By the end of 1776, the war was almost lost. Men were tired, hope was thinner than the winter air, and America stood on the edge of being forgotten, before it was ever born. This is the story of one night, when retreat meant survival, but action meant everything. Thomas Hawley had survived the winter, not because he was strong, but because he stayed. The cold had tested every man differently. Some broke quickly, others faded slowly. Thomas did neither. He endured, not out of courage, but out of refusal. A refusal to leave. A refusal to become another empty space in the line. By December, the army was no longer an army. It was a collection of men held together by exhaustion and habit. They no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of weather, of hunger, of whether their hands would still respond in the morning. Commands were given quietly now, not because discipline was strong, but because voices had grown tired of echoing into nothing. Boots were gone. Men wrapped cloth around bleeding feet, tying them tight with string or torn strips of uniform. Each step left a mark behind, quickly buried by snow. Uniforms were rags, patched, stiff with dirt and frost, barely worthy of the name they carried. Faces had lost their youth. Cheeks hollowed, eyes dulled. Boys who had marched in with songs now stared at the ground as if afraid to meet what they had become. At night, Thomas watched men sit silently by dying fires, hands extended toward heat that barely existed. No one complained anymore. Complaints required energy. Energy was a luxury. Across the river waited the British forces, warm, supplied, confident. Their tents stood firm. Their boots were dry. Their fires burned without apology. They ate well. They slept knowing tomorrow would look much like today. From their side of the river, the rebellion looked small, temporary, already fading. They believed the rebellion was finished. Thomas could feel that belief pressing down on them like the weight of the sky. He saw it in the way some men avoided looking across the water, in the way conversations ended when the river came into view, in the way hope no longer announced itself, but waited to be asked. Many Americans believed it too. The order came quietly, no cheers, no speeches. It didn't arrive with the weight of command, but with the stillness of inevitability. Officers moved through the camp without raising their voices, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might break something already fragile. Only a sentence passed from officer to officer. "We crossed the river tonight." Men looked at one another. Not in surprise, in recognition. They had known this moment would come, the moment when waiting was no longer an option. Some men swallowed hard. Others pressed their lips together, as if holding back words that would not change the order anyway. The Delaware River was swollen with ice. The night was dark, the boats were few. Chunks of ice drifted slowly across the surface, colliding softly, like warnings that did not need to be spoken. The current moved with purpose, cold and unforgiving. Anyone who fell in would not fight the water for long. Crossing meant risk. Staying meant certainty. Certainty of hunger. Certainty of collapse. Certainty that the rebellion would fade quietly into memory. Some men lowered their heads. They thought of homes that still existed without them. Of wives who might already be learning how to live alone. Of children who would grow up with questions that could never be answered. Others stared at the river like it was a question with no right answer. A few whispered prayers. Not for victory, but for the strength to keep moving when fear had already done its worst. No one spoke of heroism. No one spoke of glory. Those were words for another time, another place. Thomas said nothing. He stood still, hands at his sides, breath rising in thin clouds before him. Around him, men shifted their weight, adjusted worn straps, tightened grips on muskets that felt heavier than ever. Inside his coat, against his chest, he felt the folded paper. The letter, the words he had written by firelight. The promise he had made without knowing how it would be kept. He remembered the letter inside his coat. The boats moved without sound. Kangko Hayulan, Kangko Tingi. Chako nung bon di long ls bg zung thian. Nova hn sd han thit chin t ccn chen. GQ na DGI trung liang seether G guak riem bt kinang mai chow. Shumen shisi. Oars cut through black water, thick with ice. The river groaned like it was alive, resisting every inch. Dong Delaware kang tri, naji enguk lay. Nung ming bang va van men thian, kao xxg, nutha mua nik na hrang thian nyan kang hung via fiam biak tki. Enchi si yen gc's quan. Elin hin mcc chisien shimvao losses sanbt u rakt louis. Thomas chi gi, enchian chat mai chow. Nung vanch g the rap seat vow long ban te gntent lao lao. Thomas's hands bled as he pulled. Mu nop chow lon to cnn cow and gi. Mal hoa vow enchi si, been emptied in gay lpptis. Kenji lay dsu vgt, nother cha ting ti. Kai len hang sao vao kan te. Lam chung td, nangan kang dung lay. Gung laying gyur vvi bakuan tri. Ice struck the hull, men slipped. Kogichu chan vien vao, em van thian. Mt tizispa nu ching. Ju. Mt gi rijun enchi si. One fell into the water and did not come back up. Kangko ting het. Kangko kai vi te siya susiu. Chakong di kung trung mu ra trong ji hun, re kep lay nan. Ho si sti jen, mad kang ai dam tin rang chire. Ho via zo ra. No one shoutin'. Kang fi vn hvn cm. Ma vi and fan lesson they, la the sha execuntem. Mt tiko. The lam thian elist. Mt kon kikung luan ko, the gitchit tc. There was no time for grief. Ndi kao bun nen lay, epsao jun ke linden gek. Chafamthi, gin kuk, kunthi gim now. Above them, snow fell softly, indifferent to history. Tuite re nun nung and long tring, fach lan ma. Lan vi lan chis, sang hang quan chi. Na kang bithan chin tran. Kang bithan hai cinch. No ri hu, thun nyan, nother kiam na kan ko hiog hin ji gienchen. Thomas kio mai chow, hai thi ji kuang. Trong kong kik ingen gg jia hai nop chow, tam tri an tri sha ki dong sen yen. Thomas thought of Margaret. And henchen ggn mtc trong an yen diu. Enchen cash si gi tun an ki kan na ing ten. Anak ji hen emti ga trak nach ba, mung man ko the. Elisi na gcc ting kakechu gg hon ton kang he bit rang. Chow na hen chi si seng ggc tn. Tien, to the ggc, tnt. Of a child who might already know how to cry. Angi han bieb si tha. Nundong chavit vuan heng chan than. Li han anji, jate thou giffy. Rejate sat tim fen. Nuvate neoju an vvi the gg fiasau. He thought of the promise he had written. Empty nop chow nia, re them empty nop nia. Kang vien shin thing. Kang vien luch espi. Chavien ngyk. The vng bdhu, and kang the dung lay, and he kept rowing. When they reached the opposite shore, men collapsed into the snow. Some fell to their knees. Others simply lay there, faces pressed into the white ground, as if the earth itself could hold them in place. Breath came in ragged clouds. Hands shook uncontrollably, not from fear anymore, but from the sudden realization that they were still alive. Some prayed, not loudly, not with words rehearsed, just murmured thanks carried away by the cold. Some laughed quietly, not because it was funny, but because they were still alive. It was the kind of laughter that escaped before reason could stop it. Thin, broken, almost ashamed. Men covered their mouths as if sound itself might punish them for surviving when others had not. Thomas sat in the snow, chest heaving, hands numb and bleeding. He did not look back at the river. He knew what it would show him: empty water, broken ice, and the places where men had vanished without a trace. He chose not to look. Survival had already asked enough. The order to move came softly. There was no ceremony, no moment of rest long enough to feel safe. Muskets were lifted. Boots, still wet, were forced back onto frozen feet. Bodies that had just endured the impossible were asked to move again. The attack that followed was brief, confused, decisive. Darkness and surprise did the work that strength could not. Shouts rang out, then cut short. Shadows collided. Commands overlapped. For a few disorienting moments, no one knew who was winning. Only that stopping meant dying. Thomas moved forward because the men beside him did. He fired when told. He ran when pushed. He did not feel brave. He felt empty, as if everything unnecessary had been stripped away, leaving only motion. When it was over, the silence returned. Different now. Heavier. Real. By morning, the impossible had happened. Light crept slowly over the frozen ground, revealing men who still stood. Men who had crossed a river at night and lived to see another day. Smoke rose from small fires. Voices, hoarse but present, called out names, and sometimes heard an answer. The army still existed, not strong, not whole, but unbroken. The war was not over. Thomas stood at the edge of the camp as the sun climbed higher, warming nothing, but illuminating everything. Around him were faces marked by frost and fatigue, and something else, fragile but undeniable. And for the first time in months, hope returned, not as an idea, but as a fact. No monuments were built for that night. There were no stones raised along the riverbank. No flags planted where boots had sunk into ice. No speeches delivered to mark what had happened in the dark hours before dawn. No names were carved for the men who crossed the river. History would remember generals. It would remember dates. Books would speak of strategy and consequence, of victories measured on maps and timelines. They would tell the story cleanly, efficiently, as if the night itself had passed without resistance. But history would not remember frozen hands or bleeding palms, or the silence that carried them across. It would not remember the way men avoided one another's eyes afterward, knowing who had been beside them before the river and who had not been thereafter. It would not remember the weight of breath in the cold, or the way survival felt less like triumph and more like obligation. Thomas stood on the far bank, watching the sun rise. Light spilled slowly across the frozen ground, revealing nothing remarkable, just men gathering their things, just breath rising into the air. Just another morning in a war that refused to end neatly. He felt the ache in his hands, the stiffness in his shoulders, the quiet inside him where fear had once lived. He knew that by tomorrow, orders would come again, that there would be more marchers, more nights, more losses that would never be recorded. He also knew that somewhere, beyond the river and the cold, a child might be learning how to breathe, that a woman might be standing at a doorway, listening for a sound that would not come. Thomas did not feel like a hero. He felt small, tired, present, and that was enough. He had crossed when turning back would have been easier. He had stayed when leaving would have been forgiven. He had endured a night no one would commemorate, for a future he might never see. He was still alive. And for the first time, he believed that might matter.